Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to come from the 8th chapter of the book of Deuteronomy. And the word Deuteronomy, when dissected, it translates as a second telling or a repetition of the law. So it was delivered by Moses. These were his parting words, a farewell address of a sorts to a nation he had led, that nation being Israel. Where he led them was from captivity to the border of the promised land. And so every struggle and pain they went through in the ordeal of the wandering had a purpose, and he explains much of that purpose in this chapter. And so we want to really lay hold of the historical significance it represents, of the historical context. It represents a pivotal turning point in the history of a nation, which became a nation within a nation of Egypt, who eventually enslaved them, and they were liberated through the hand of Yahweh, who performed miracles through Moses, the man who's delivering these words. And it was in order that they might lay hold of the land that was promised to their ancestor, their progenitor, Abraham. And the opening verse reads, "Guard to do every command which I teach you today, that you might live, and shall increase, and go in, and shall possess the land of which Yahweh swore to your fathers." So the purpose for obedience to the command in the present, we're all creatures of time and space, and we remain at the mercy of our present location and the present time frame we're in. One cannot live in the past or the future. It is simply impossible. But one can learn from the past in order to prepare for the future. So I think the lesson in this book really transcends its historical circumstance to any era of what we can live. And the purpose for which we obey is to live and multiply, prosper, essentially. But with prosperity comes challenges we might not otherwise have. And we're going to get to that. "And you shall remember that Yahweh your Elohim led you all the way these 40 years in the wilderness, to humble you, prove you, to know that is in your heart, whether you guard his commands or not." So all the trials and tribulations they had endured the past 40 years of being a wandering, nomadic nation on the move, wandering over essentially the equivalent area of the size of New Jersey, was for a purpose. And Yahweh frequently inflicted, the journey was arduous in itself, and so there was pain attached to the journey, but the pain was for a purpose, and the purpose is to lay hold of the one whose purpose can give meaning to life. Because living a life without meaning, once you've lived life with meaning, you cannot look back as a life lived without meaning, without regarding it as a waste of life. "And he humbled you, and let you suffer hunger, and fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, to make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but by all that comes from the mouth of Yahweh." There's a lot to digest in this verse, so we're going to break it down from the top. Now, the first thing which strikes one is that Yahweh let evil or pain or suffering be inflicted with his children. But why would he do that, we have to ask, because this is difficult to reconcile as how a loving deity could do such. But every persecution we endure is rooted in love. It's the furnace of affliction through which the spirit is fired, is refined. And really, we cannot know certain things about ourselves and about our Maker if life was all prosperity and joy and happiness. That's not the purpose of life. And it's really, our trials are to draw us closer to are the source of our salvation, where we can live eternally in a world without sin or sickness or suffering or crying or any other things along those lines. And the manna was food from the heaven. It was bread of sorts, which he supplied his nomadic people. They weren't agricultural. They could only hunt so much, and they were in a desert, a sparsely populated area, as far as human animal life is concerned. Plant and animal life is sparse in the desert, so there wasn't a lot to eat. But Yahweh made them able to eat by raining bread from the heavens. And of course, the Israelites eventually eventually became desensitized by the miracle, and they were complaining about the diversity of foods which they had as slaves in Egypt. So they were enjoying the security of bondage above the challenges of freedom. And that's an attitude we are to avoid at all cost, because everything good in life comes with challenge we might not otherwise know in a more neutral or negative context. And he was also referring to the word that they did not know. Now, the human body it has different faculties and different capacities. It has a physical flesh, which requires food, bread, physical food to sustain physical beings, but man is also a spiritual creature, and we thirst. The entire world there's a famine across the world for the word, and it thirsts, but that word can be quenched and satisfied by recognizing that we are spiritual beings operating in human vessels rather than human vessels, vice versa. And we can really, now with that mindset, we can not aspire to live by bread alone. We don't neglect our bodily needs, but we prioritize the spiritual. And the purpose for this was that bread is temporary, the life it gives is temporary, it's repeated and necessary, but the life that Yahweh gives is forever. And we witnessed the Savior cite this at a 40-day fast at the dawn of his mortal ministry. In the synoptic accounts, Luke and Matthew supply details of the exchange, of the dialogue between the Savior and the adversary, and three successive temptations he answers the adversary with words from this book, and the first of which is him being at the most vulnerable to physical needs. He tempts him to make these stones bread, and he says, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceed from the mouth of Yahweh. So that's how he deflected the first temptation. And now, your garments did not wear out on you, nor did your foot swell these 40 years. So in spite of the encumbrances and enduring the encumbrances of travel, their ability, their instruments for traveling, be they feet, internal or external shoes, were still in mint condition to do more traveling, and that was through the source of a divine power. Thus you shall know in your heart that as a man disciplines his son, so Yahweh your Elohim disciplines you. There is such a thing as tough love, and sometimes it is more loving to discipline a child than to permit it and to let him have his own way. Now, the role of discipline is indispensable to to family life. Children cannot be expected to function as adults in the absence of the provision of such, and no more than a loving parent would deny or neglect the disciplining of their children can Yahweh look over his children with similar indifference. Now we read that the Hebrews were his firstborn son, and we read of this in Exodus 4:22 and Hosea 11:1. By that is meant that Yahweh loves the entire world, even those who don't even know him or know that he loves them, because he is the maker of heaven and earth. But he revealed himself especially to the nation of Israel, who was chosen, referenced as the chosen people, for the purpose for which they were to witness to him in the world. Therefore you shall guard the commands of Yahweh your Elohim, to walk in his ways and to fear him. So the purpose of the commands is to walk in his ways, or to have the mind of the Father, the heart of the Father, and the will of the Father. And the mind follows the will, which follows the heart, or whatever I just said. And fearing is a faithful fear. Generally, we categorize the terms as antithetical, the idea being that no more than faith and fear can dwell in this simultaneously in the same vessel, but fear in Yahweh is the fear which expels all other fears. So there is such a thing as a faithful fear, and we want to bear that in mind. For Yahweh your Elohim is bringing you into a good land, a land of streams of water, of fountains and springs that flow out of valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley, of vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olive oil and honey. So he's giving a grocery list of the natural and food sources they can expect to enjoy in this land. So he's whetting their appetite to endure on the journey in order to lay claim of what he has hold in store for them. And this is a land of milk and honey, referred to in Genesis 3, 8, and 17, and elsewhere throughout the Pentateuch. And so it's a good land. It's abundant. It's fruitful. They're in the desert where parched, nothing can grow there, no animals to eat or kill. But they're going to a land where life is going to be significantly easier than what they've endured the past 40 years. A land in which you eat bread without scarcity, in which you do not lack at all, a land whose stone are iron, and out of whose hills you dig copper. And you shall eat and be satisfied, and shall bless Yahweh your Elohim for the good land which he has given you. Now the temptation and challenge of prosperity is that we become so accustomed to having our every desire accommodated that we neglect our Maker in the process of that. And there's a reason that Yahweh doesn't permit us to go through life without trials, and that's because we would be spiritually spoiled. We would only call on him when we need something. And now the prosperity also engenders the illusion of self-sufficiency. No one is entirely self-sufficient or able to not only feed themselves but satisfy others in their superabundance, as is the Maker of heaven and earth. And the prosperity brings a host of temptations that might not otherwise be there in the absence. And fair weather is equally, the other extreme is equally potentially detrimental to our spiritual welfare. And that is something which I honestly don't feel is entirely relevant to what I should communicate. Be on guard, lest you forget Yahweh your Elohim, by not guarding his commands and his judgments and his laws, which I command you today. So he's reiterating the warning. Now the consequences for disobedience are spelled out, and obedience are spelled out in the 28th chapter of Deuteronomy. And now the covenant was a two-way street. There were blessings for prosperity, which ultimately led them to neglect the covenant, and there were consequences and warnings for disobedience. And it was appropriate for them. That was the covenant they had entered into. They were the unique amongst nations, and that they had a covenant. Now the term covenant was a political and diplomatic term common to the era. It essentially governed the respective parties' relations to one another and imposed barriers and restraints and observation. So it was invariably given from a stronger party to a weaker party, and no one is stronger than Yahweh. And lest you eat and be satisfied, and build lovely houses, and shall dwell in them, and your herds and your flocks increase, and your silver and your gold are increased, and all that you have is increased, that your heart then becomes lifted up, and you forget Yahweh your Elohim, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage. So the same source which had liberated them from slavery and degradation and hard labor and toil and no freedom and no identity, no dignity as human beings, was liberating them for a purpose. And now there were parts in this journey which made them look back with fond nostalgia at the period and the conditions in which they were enslaved. But it's really irrational from the outside looking in. Who led you through that great and awesome wilderness, fiery serpents and scorpions and thirst, where there was no water, who brought water for you out of the flinty rocks. So he's recalling their experience in which there was no resources for which to feed themselves, supplied by an external and supernatural force. And he's just going over a laundry list or items of what they endured in the wilderness journey. Who fed you in the wilderness with manna, which your fathers did not know, in order to humble you and to try you, to do good in the end. Now, this is an essential reiteration of verse 3, but we also witness new terminology here, such as try. And the fact is that God cannot tempt us. The adversary only does so at his permission and behest, but God does test us. He allows the adversary to tempt us. And the purpose of that is to draw us closer to him, because without the challenge, we can never have the choice. So it makes more sense for a being of love to want to be loved in response rather than something robotic or manufactured. You then shall say in your heart, my power and the strength of my hand have made for me this wealth. This is the illusion of self-sufficiency I earlier referred to, that they are instructed to avoid for good reasons. But you shall remember Yahweh your Elohim, for it is he who gives you power to get wealth, in order to establish his covenant, which he swore to your fathers, as it is today. So even wealthy people who have no inkling or concept of a divine source are the beneficiaries of his grace nonetheless. They cannot produce what they have without his grace and bounty. And it shall be, if you by any means forget Yahweh your Elohim, and follow other mighty ones, and serve them, and bow yourselves to them, I have warned you that this day you shall certainly perish. Yahweh is as good as his word, and he honors every promise, so this is not an idle threat, but really ingratitude leads to idolatry, so we need to nip it in the bud. When we find ourselves becoming ungrateful for the blessings, we're one step away from worshiping other deities. Like the nations which Yahweh is destroying before you, so you are to perish, because you did not obey his voice of Yahweh your Elohim. Now, if these idolaters were so punished without having the benefit of instruction as to correct worship and proper theology, it's understanding that the same standard of just retribution and divine wrath would apply to the Israelites who should know better. And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Tune in next time.